Good morning. I want to talk to you this morning about something really important. I want to talk to you about being faithful in your circumstances. Being faithful in your circumstances. Jesus said, when I return, and we're in that time, I believe, that time period, nearing the coming of Christ in the 7 year tribulation period. And he said, when I return, will I find any faith? And that Greek word is also faithful. Will I find any faithful? And we see that consistent through Scripture there. Matthew 24 talks about the end of the age, and then in 25 it talks about the 5 wise and 5 foolish virgins, and they fell asleep, and how the importance of keeping the oil and keeping the light in our lamps. And of course, we've talked about a lot of that in previous videos. I would encourage you to go back and watch previous videos there on Walking with God by the River uh, YouTube channel. I believe there's some videos there that got missed by people that I think could be really, really helpful. And I would encourage you to post the messages if you feel it. If you feel it, let God talk to your heart about that. This isn't any sales pitch. That's not what we're interested in at all. But I know a couple people that took it on themselves to post the video on their Facebook, and there's been numerous people reached that were unaware. So that's totally your call. But I did kind of feel prompted today to mention that. But being faithful in your circumstances, there is not a better example in the Bible, I believe, than Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And that's a familiar story to many of you who grew up in church. But that's powerful, powerful stuff. You talk about being faithful in circumstances. And let's just get the setting real quick, because I think this is needed. Nobody's journey is easy. Ephesians 6, we fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And we see that at work. However, we're nearing the time when there's going to be more and more conflict between flesh and blood. Because as the principalities and powers influence more and more people, there comes conflict. And I believe there's a war coming on Jews and Christians. I believe that with all of my heart. And we're not going to that today, but nobody's journey is easy. Being faithful in your circumstances. And that's a broad term, circumstances. It can be your home. Maybe you're the only believer in your home. It can be a division in the home. It can be in the greater family. It can be a lot of things. It can be in the workplace. But you know what your fight is. I like a line that my one son uses. He says, I want to fight my good fight. Remember, Paul the Apostle said, I have fought a good fight. I have kept the faith. And this son asked one time, what's your fight? What's your fight? I want to fight my good fight. What's your area of difficulty? What's the cross that you're bearing? As I said, and feel kind of prompted to emphasize this, some are in a marriage where there just isn't the commitment to the Lord they want to see, and there's a division because of that, and it causes stress and difficulty. I don't know what your fight is, but fight your good fight and keep the faith, being faithful in your circumstances. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in an incredibly difficult situation. They were captives in Babylon. And this was an evil, evil culture, sinful culture. In fact, the story in Daniel about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the fiery furnace that many are familiar with. They were being punished because they wouldn't bow to an image. And many believe, Bible historians believe, Reverend Bishop, one of my mentors, believed that image was not the image of a man, but rather the part of a man, a frolic image. And this was a corrupt society, and this was a very difficult situation. Perfect timing to say, you know what, I can't deal with all of this. This is too much pressure. Anybody ever feel that way? And I think the devil tries to put the pressure on us. They were in difficult circumstances. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were in a culture where they were captives, but they were brilliant young men, an outstanding young men, and they were chosen to work for the king. But if you can put yourself just briefly in their situation, they're away from their homeland, Israel. They're captives in a strange land. Their identity had even been messed with. Their names were changed. We call them Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but their names were even changed. And so they were in a very difficult situation with, many would say, every reason to give up and throw in the towel. And this is too much. But it's interesting, the decisions that they made and the result of those decisions. And I want to somehow, with God's help, get this across to you, that if you'll make the decision, you don't have to go all the distance. No, He'll help you do that. He'll enable you. Yes, the Holy Spirit will enable you. But the decision is your call. That's why we're always asking you to step up and be in the remnant. It's your decision. He watches and waits to see. Previous videos, I've talked about this a lot. He watches to see what our decision is. We see this again here as Daniel, Shadrach, and Meshach, and Abednego were in very, very difficult circumstances. Their name had been changed. They were serving the king. They were away from their homeland. Every reason, most would say, to throw in the towel. But there's a powerful verse that's the key to the whole thing, and it's Daniel 1:8. And I love it, and I have it here before me. It says, Daniel purposed in his heart. And you'll find later that these other three men were in harmony with this. Daniel purposed. The NLT says Daniel determined. And it's even a little deeper than that. It's a determination with grit, and regardless of the cost. You know, it's one thing to say, I'm determined to get there. It's another thing to say, even if they kill me, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you can go ahead and throw me in the furnace, but that doesn't change my mind. It's one thing to say, I'm determined to do this. It's another thing to say, you know what? Even if you take my life and take my head, I'm still doing this. And that is an amazing, amazing commitment. But Daniel 1:8 says that Daniel purposed, he determined in his heart that he was not going to defile himself. He was not going to give in to these pressures, not going to give in to these pressures. I have written here, and I got 5 things I want to give you, just nuggets of truth, and would encourage you even to jot them down, and they would be great to add to your prayer list. Number 1, God watches for our decision in our bad circumstances. So I'm in a difficult marriage, let's say. That might be what you would say today. I am blessed with a wonderful marriage and a wonderful partner in my older years. But here we are, oftentimes divided in the home, and that is the case many times. God watches for our decision, our bad circumstances. Oh, well, these pressures, and oh, well, I don't have some of the advantages others have, and oh boy, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this, and the odds are against me, and on and on. The devil will feed you negativity, and of course you'll have naysayers out there that always are encouraging to go the wrong direction. I want to encourage you today to make the right decision in your bad circumstances. Daniel determined, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego determined, you can throw me in the furnace, but I'm not bowing to this nonsense. You can throw me in the furnace, but I am not bowing to this nonsense. What a commitment. But oh my, as we'll look here in a few minutes, did they find favor with God? So God watches, number 1, for our decision in our bad circumstances. And I want to put a little parenthesis here. You'll be tested at some point on that decision. You know, I've heard people rattle off, why I do this and I do that. And why I'll do this for the Lord and I'll do that for the Lord. I recently had someone I dearly love and have mentored that I've heard say all the things they would do for the Lord. And I feel like the Lord actually said, okay, I'm going to take you through each of those and see if you'll do them. You know, we can all say what we're going to do, but you'll be tested on what you said. I remember when I went to the hospital 19 years ago, marvelously healed of leukemia. Didn't expect that healing. I actually thought my life would come to an end there. at 50. But I knew that I was being tested on some things I had preached passionately. I knew I was being tested on some things I had preached passionately. And the Laodicean church, which is the last days church we read in Revelation, the last church age, the Laodicean church. And I believe that is the last church age, and that's a proper interpretation of Scripture. He says you're lukewarm. He says you're lukewarm. He says you need to be tried in the fire. And I think a lot of you are having trying situations. Nobody's journey is easy. But God watches for our decision in our bad circumstances, okay? Number 2, we must take a non-compromise position regardless of our situation, regardless of the culture around us. We must take a non-compromise position regardless of our circumstances around us. Romans 12:2 says, be not conformed to the world, but be transformed. In the middle of a world that's putting the squeeze on, and they're trying to conform you into the world's mold, and they're trying to, Romans 12:2, go back and read, it's a powerful verse, be not conformed to the world, but be transformed. There's one translation that says, don't let the world pour you into its mold. And I was quoting that a second ago. But the squeeze is on. But God calls us to a non-compromise position of faithfulness. Remember, the title of the message is being faithful in your circumstances. There is grace to be faithful. There is grace to be faithful. No, you can't do it. I had a young Christian come to me and said, I can't go back to that factory. I just can't do it. I know I received the Lord and I've been baptized and I know that the Lord has touched me, but I just don't believe I can go back to that factory. And I shocked him. I looked at him and said, no, you can't. Didn't expect that answer. But I said, you and the Lord can, and he'll give you grace hour by hour, and you'll come back to me in 3 months. If you stay faithful and keep your time with the Lord in the morning and go into that factory and trust in his grace, you'll come back to me in 3 months and say, hey, I'm doing this thing. Because grace is available. We don't sing Amazing Grace for nothing. He'll amaze you right in your circumstances, being faithful in your circumstances. So God watches for our decision in our bad circumstances. Number 2, he calls us to take a non-compromise position. And real quick, I'm gonna share some verses here. Daniel, chapter 1, verse 9. I'm gonna need my glasses here. Just so you get a clear picture of what I want to say next. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. That's interesting. I'll come back to that. And he said, I am afraid of the king. This is the chief of staff. I am afraid of the king. He has ordered that you eat this food and wine. Now, one thing I left out, Daniel purposed in his heart he would not defile himself. He did not want to partake in eating of the food and the wine that was given to them by the king. He didn't want it. This food that had been sacrificed to idols, and I will not go into all that, but Daniel refused to participate in what they wanted him to do. Okay, a non-compromise position, and should have mentioned that earlier, but that's so important. Now God gave the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. And the chief of staff said, I'm afraid of the king. He's ordered you to eat this food and wine. And if you become pale and thin compared to the others, the king's going to behead me. In other words, you got to do this. And Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days, he said, on a diet of vegetables and water. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look. You get what he's doing here? He says, I'm not eating this, I'm not drinking this king's wine and participating in this. I'll just test this out. The guy says, hey, you're a nice fellow and all that, and I've grown to like you and have some respect for you, but I'll get my head cut off if you don't follow the plan that the king has for you men to flourish and become his helpers. Daniel says, test us with vegetables and water. And at the end of 10 days, see how we are compared to the other men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. Now stay with me. I usually don't read this much, but this is good stuff. At the end of 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men, I want you to notice that, who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine that the king had insisted. God gave notice, God gave these 4 men, Daniel, whose name had been changed to Belteshazzar, not to be confused with Belshazzar the king, and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's names had been changed as well. God gave these 4 men unusual understanding in every aspect of literature and wisdom, and God gave Daniel special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. And when the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought out the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar, and the king talked with them, and he was so impressed with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, I'm not going to read any more of that because that leads into the next point that I want you to see. You will have God's favor. You will have God's favor. In those verses, I'd encourage you to go back and read them a little slower than I did. I'm trying to get a lot in here. You will have God's favor. There's nothing like God's favor. There's nothing like God's favor. And the longer you serve the Lord and you begin reaping the benefits and the years go by, you know, sometimes when you first become a Christian, you're reaping things from your past and your own decisions, and it's not always pretty. But as you get this thing rolling here, you start reaping from decisions you prayed about, from things you decided 5 years ago while you were walking with the Lord and spending time with Him. And this, you'll begin to enter a time of favor. And Pam and I have experienced that wonderfully. God's favor is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So God watches for our decision in bad circumstances. That was number 1. We must take a non-compromised position in our bad circumstances in our culture. You will find God's favor. He gave him favor with the chief of staff. He gave him favor to his request and made those men more healthy than all the others. You see God's favor. I could spend a lot of time on that because God's favor is a wonderful thing, but I want to include a couple more points. Next, you honor God, He'll honor you. Point number 4, you honor God, He'll honor you. Let me repeat the passage. The chief of staff said, I'm afraid of the king. He's ordered you to eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin, and compared to the others your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. Then over to verse 20, we see that the king talked with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, and he was so impressed with them. And the king consulted them in any manner requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, and found them to be 10 times more capable than any of his magicians or enchanters in the entire kingdom. And Daniel remained in royal service until the first reign of King Cyrus. Wow. You honor him, he'll honor you. Powerful stuff. Now, number 5. You show up despite your circumstances. You listening? You show up despite your circumstances. God will show up. Farther back in the book, chapter 6, chapter 3. First, I'll do 3. They showed up. They showed up with the commitment. Despite the unfair circumstances of being captives in a strange land, they didn't buckle. They stayed faithful. It got so bad that the 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were at the big party And the demand was that you'll bow and worship the image that I referred to earlier in the message. And we believe that to be the part of a man and not just the image of a man. And they said, we will not. I'd encourage you to read Daniel 3 in your devotions this week. I'm not going to go to it. It'll be too lengthy. I want to stay on point. But they gave them two opportunities because they didn't bow. And they said, well, maybe you didn't hear. Maybe you didn't understand the instructions. We're going to do this again. Make sure that then you are to bow to this image. You are going to bow to this image. And that's when the powerful statement was made by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that we are not going to bow. And they didn't. And they were thrown in the fiery furnace. And as they were in the furnace, it says the furnace was so hot, so hot that it killed the guys throwing them in. If I remember just how that was worded, but that's a powerful. And the king looked in the furnace and said, how many did you put in the furnace? And they said 3. And he said, I see 4 in there, and the 4th looks like the Son of God. You show up, he'll show up. Are you listening? You show up, he'll show up. God called Pam and I to the streets, something that wasn't very popular, and I understand all that. No access to grind here. But God called us from a very prosperous, productive, growing church, full church, where we just started a number of new ministries. He called us to the streets of Chicago, and looking back, it all makes sense. Life's lived forward and understood backwards as a Christian. Didn't make sense to a lot of people at the time, but I knew God had spoken to us, and I told Pam, we got to show up. We got to show up, and I wait for her to have confirmation, and she had confirmation. And she left her comfortable home where we had grown up and raised the boys. Big step for a woman to take. And we went to the streets of Chicago. Went to the streets of Chicago by God's grace, not in our own strength, but in God's grace. We worked on the streets on the weekends from 11 at night till 3 in the morning. He called us, so I say it humbly, but we showed up. And there were some hard decisions. And those circumstances weren't easy. But you show up, he'll show up. Did we have some marvelous, marvelous things happen on the streets of Chicago? Did we see some deliverance? I don't know how many people in the Moody Bible Institute evangelism training classes that were under our leadership on the street ministry. Kind of the more gutsy kids picked that one. You could pick a ministry to be in Chicago somewhere under a pastor. And some of the more gutsy ones picked us. I don't know how many have gone into the ministry from that. And the seeds were planted. Plus, it showed us the depravity of the human condition. And it prepared us to open the outreach center for 12 years on the highway there on 31. You show up. God will show up. All right. I also would ask you not only to read Daniel 3, but to read Daniel chapter 6. The familiar story when we were children to many of us, Daniel in the lion's den. Oh, you're not to pray to anybody but the king. You show up, he'll show up. After the decree was given the order was given and signed and sealed that you were not to pray to any other god but the king, it says that Daniel opened his window, I believe it was 3 times a day, and looked toward Jerusalem and prayed. And he was arrested. And the national punishment, the capital punishment in those days was lion's den. Hungry lions, wow. And what a powerful, powerful passage we find in Daniel chapter 6, verse 19, and I am going to turn to that. We're talking about you show up, God shows up. Daniel chapter 6, verse 19. This was rooted in the decision made in that very first chapter where he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. All right. Daniel been thrown in the lion's den? That's where we are. He was in there overnight. Chapter 6, verse 19. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. And when he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God. That's interesting. What he called him? Was your God who you serve faithfully? Oh, there's that word we have in the title. There's that word we have in the title. Being faithful in your circumstances. The king called out in anguish, I'm going to repeat that. Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God who you serve faithfully. People notice if we're faithful. They're watching us in the hard times. Was he able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths. You show up, he shows up. You show up, he shows up. God sent his angels to close the lions' mouths so they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in his sight, and I've not wronged you, your majesty. Notice how he's still honoring the king from the lion's den. Talk about a man of integrity. You know, didn't smart off. Yeah, you thought you'd do away with me, but God's on my side, your majesty. A lot in that. I'll not go there. The king was overjoyed in order that Daniel be lifted out, and not a scratch was found on him, for he trusted in his God. And the king gave orders to arrest the men who had accused Daniel, and they were thrown in the lion's den with their wives and children. Wow. And the lions leaped on them and tore them to pieces. And the king sent a message to the people of every race and nation, saying that they were to serve this God. They should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God. And on it goes. I encourage you to read that. I need to sign off here. I'm at 26 minutes already. What's the point? You show up, he'll show up. You show up, he'll show up. Oh, we've seen it in our lives. I could give you countless examples. Let me hit those 5 points again. God watches for our decision in our bad circumstances. We must take a non-compromised position in our bad circumstances. But you'll have God's favor, number 3. It's a wonderful thing. Number 4, you honor him, he'll honor you. Number 5, if you show up despite your circumstances, he will show up. What's holding us back? What's holding us back? Step out in faith. Trust him. Some of you have some very, very hard circumstances. Step out in faith and trust him. One thing I just felt prompted real quick, I need to say, because fear often holds us back. Fear holds us back. Remember when the chief of staff said, I am afraid of the king who has ordered that you eat the food and the wine? That's interesting, the contrast between this chief of staff who was over Daniel and training him, and Daniel who said, come on, try me. Just give us vegetables. Just give us vegetables and water. Come on, try us. See the contrast? We're often shackled by fear, and it holds us back. Breakthrough felt like that was for somebody. Didn't even seem like it fit in real well there, but I believe that was for somebody. And I want to always follow my heart on that. I felt prompted to go back to that verse. What's holding you back? What's holding you back? Be faithful. Being faithful in your bad circumstances. God has the grace to do that.